get started, I'd like to start by introducing myself. My name is Dr. Marian Diaz, and I am the Director of Thriving in Ministry at Catholic Theological Union. I also serve as the Director of our continuing education programs. Thriving in Ministry is a grant from the Lilly Endowment that enables us to do research and programming on support of Catholic, what I could refer to as Catholic professionals in ministry. So we really do work at developing programming and this content to try to help all Catholic professionals in ministry, no matter what their state of life might be. And so, as Richard and I were having a conversation a few months ago and really started dreaming about what this series might look like. So I'm very excited to see this becoming a reality starting tonight and over the next 3 weeks, next 2 following weeks after this. As we begin, I want us to just take a little time to pause and center. We all know what a difficult time this has been. We've all potentially had loss, a death, even a major transition perhaps in our lives in the past year. Maybe we've accompanied people who have been ill, close to death, or died. We really wanted to take this time to step back and honor this season in our church year by really reflecting and pondering, I think is the great word that we're using to say pondering death in the month of Holy Souls. So I just invite you perhaps to call to mind someone who you might be missing right now, someone who meant a lot to you. And I'm just going to read a brief quote from Annie Lamont. She writes, "You will lose someone you can't live without, and your heart will be badly broken. And the bad news is that you never completely get over the loss of your beloved. But this is also the good news. They live forever in your broken heart that doesn't seal back up. And you come through. It's like having a broken leg that never heals perfectly, that still hurts when the weather gets cold, but you learn to dance with a limp." So we ask God's presence with us this evening as we ponder death, reflect on the lives of those that were lost, and we learn to dance with a limp. So I'm really excited for those of you who don't know Father Richard Fragomeni. He is a priest of the Diocese of Albany, New York, and he serves as the rector of the Shrine of Our Lady of Pompeii in Chicago, in Little Italy in Chicago. He serves as the professor of liturgy and preaching at CTU, and he has been at CTU since 1990. So he will be presenting today, sharing his screen, sharing his wisdom with us. And then when he's done, I will be taking some time to take questions through the chat. So you'll be able to interact with him a bit. We are going to be recording the series. And then potentially it will be up eventually on our website at Learn at CTU. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our topic for tonight, which is Stories of Immortality, the way we talk about the afterlife. Father Richard?
Good evening, everyone. I'm getting used to, as I said to Marian earlier, I'm getting used to doing these presentations from sitting on my couch and talking to you as if you're really here, and you are virtually really here, but I'm talking to my computer screen. Um, so I'm glad to see so many of you joining us for this conversation. The topic about immortality narratives comes from me teaching a course on death literature at DePaul University, because one of the other things that I do is I'm an adjunct professor at DePaul University, where I teach 3 courses a year. And in the fall, I always teach a course on narratives, death narratives, and literature of immortality and death. And I have 40 students on Zoom, which I'm learning to use this Zoom so I creatively enough, and it saves me driving out to DePaul and all of this. So a part of Marion's request to me was to do something in the month of November, and I thought, well, what a great topic. We'll start talking about immortality narratives, which we'll do tonight. Then next week, we'll talk about the narrative of purgatory, which is a doctrine that we cherish as Roman Catholics from the 12th century onward. And the doctrine has been reinterpreted for us in a beautiful way by Benedict XVI, our Pope Emeritus, in his wonderful encyclical Spe Salvi. So we're going to take a look at that way, the way he narrates, if you would, our understanding of purgatory next week. And on the third week, we are scheduled to talk in this series about planning our own funerals. And I see that many of you are in religious communities, and I know as a diocesan priest as well, we're supposed to have a file prepared of what we want to happen at our funerals. And so some of you may have already prepared this, others you may be doing it, but you include in that file, who do you want to preach at your funeral? What songs do you want? What readings have you chosen? How do you want to be buried? All of that. We're going to talk about that on the third night of this series. But for tonight, we're going to take a look at immortality narratives. And I'd like to start by saying that this topic of death has always excited me since a child. I have been fascinated by death. I used to actually sneak in to the funeral home not too far from our church so that I could see my friends who they told me were dead. And I was a little kid, maybe 7, 8 years old. And at that time, they did not want to bring children to wakes. Things have changed since then, but in my neck of the woods, Schenectady, New York, children were not to be brought to wakes because there was something you wanted to protect children from, and that was from the question of mortality. We were too young to have to face it. But curious me, I was always interested, so I would go into the funeral home and see my friends, neighbors who had died. And the funeral director caught me one day, reported it to my mother, and she would never allow me to go in. There was this taboo around death, and yet I was fascinated by it and still am. I was the chief altar server at funerals when I was a kid. I got to go to all the funerals and get out of school and assist the priest singing all kinds of Gregorian chants. And again, just really fascinated by this. My mother, who knew this all her life, died at 94 years old in 2014. And on her deathbed, I was sitting next to her, holding her hand, and I thought I would be pastoral, in a priestly way. And so I said, "Ma, are you thinking about dying?" And I'll never forget what this woman who loved life and who died because of an accident at the assisted living home she was in. Um, she looked at me and I said, "Ma, do you ever think about dying?" And she said, "Oh, Richard," she says, as she gave me a kind of a dirty look, "Oh, Richard, you're the only one preoccupied with that." And at the time when she said that, "Oh, you're the only one preoccupied with that," I was said, "Oh, maybe I am. I mean, Ma," and because she was living in her dying, and so I through the years since her death, 6 years now, I've been pondering what that remark means. Was it an insult? Was it an exhortation not to do this? Or was it a form of compliment? Because I'm a student of the rule of Saint Benedict that I have. I keep this on my night table, the rule of Saint Benedict. And some of you may be Benedictines or Benedictine oblates or know the rule of Benedict, because in chapter 4 of the rule of Benedict, where he talks about what are the instruments of good works, in other words, what are we to become aware of so that we can continue living our lives with good works? And so when my mother said, "You're the only one preoccupied with that," I'm realizing that she actually may be complimenting me, because that's the exact thing chapter 4 talks about in the rule of Saint Benedict, where Saint Benedict says to those who would follow this rule, he says, to keep death daily before our eyes. To keep death daily before our eyes is one of the ways he describes that we are to become instruments of good works. And so I want to thank my mother for complimenting me, because that's what I've done for a long time, and maybe some of you have as well. It's not morbid, and I've cobbled together a sentence that I give my students at DePaul to memorize. And that sentence is, again, inspired by Benedict and all of the other experiences I've had. The sentence is, die before you die, so that when you die, there's not much left of you to die. Then you can truly live before they bury you, or now cremate you. And then eye has not seen or ear has heard the possibilities of what might be. I'll never forget one of my students about 2 years ago at her final exam, when we were face to face. She said, "That really works. And I'm going to remember you on my deathbed." She said, "I'm going to remember you on my deathbed." Oh, I said, "Thank you, Narita. That's very nice." "Oh, yes, Professor, I'm going to remember you on my deathbed because it really works. Die before you die." And she gave me an example in her life where she put that into practice. The egoic death that's talking about. Not only the physical death, but the egoic death. And she says, "So I'm going to remember you on my deathbed." And she kept repeating this. And I had no idea why she kept repeating this to me. She says, "There's such wisdom in what you taught us. I will always remember you." And then I said, "Narina, what are you trying to tell me?" And she says, "I'm trying to tell you that I'm going to remember you on my deathbed." And then she pulled down her sleeve of her shirt that she was wearing, her blouse, and there, tattooed on her arm, were the words, "Die before you die," which is an interpolation of Benedict. Keep death always before your eyes. So when Marian asked me to do this, I was, you could tell I was thrilled that I could Zoom some of this passion I have about death and the experience of death. And, um, and so with that kind of introduction, let me show you the PowerPoint that I prepared for our first topic, stories of immortality. And I want to thank very, very much. I want to thank Brother Michael Joseph, Father Michael Joseph from the Capuchins, who helped, who put this PowerPoint together for me, because this is something I don't have a lot of talent with. But he pulled this together. And so I'm grateful to you, Michael Joseph. I think you're still with us. And thank you. So the topic, Stories of Immortality, comes from a book that I'm using with the students at DePaul. They actually have read the entire book a few weeks ago. And the book is called Immortality, The Quest to Live Forever and How It Drives Civilization. And it's by Stephen Cave. And what he does in this book is he does something of a kind of a cultural history of how humans, how different cultures, different religious traditions, and many times culture and religion are woven together so you can't split them apart. He gives a kind of a historical approach to the evolution of the human's attempt to assuage the anxiety and the existential anxiety over physical death by creating narratives of what Cave calls either symbolic immortality or literal immortality. And so this book that I'm using, and I will summarize tonight in the next 25 minutes or so, and I'm sorry my phone is ringing, I forgot to unplug it, just to demonstrate that life does go on. What Cave does is he basically says that in the search for human survival, cultures and religious traditions have evolved narratives of immortality. Some of these narratives offer the literal immortality, like Christianity, Judaism in our narratives, and some offer more what is called symbolic narratives immortality, like where we receive not a literal immortality beyond the grave, but a symbolic immortality beyond the grave, because somebody gives $5 million, or let's say to get us to where we want to be, $25 million to CTU, and we rename a building after that major donor. That becomes a form of symbolic immortality. So what Cave suggests is that these narratives begin and evolve over the centuries. The first attempt at immortality is called the staying alive narrative. In other words, we will reach immortality by never dying, finding an elixir like Gilgamesh in the Gilgamesh epic, or Ponce de Leon looking for the fountain of youth through elixirs and potions, and therefore finding a literal immortality by staying alive and never dying. And so there we have John Travolta in that song, Staying Alive, Staying Alive. And you have to thank Michael Joseph for this configuration of thoughts. This staying alive elixir of life is still around. We still want to at least extend our lives. And so the narrative of immortality about staying alive turns into a gym membership and taking vitamins and prolonging life through a variety of elixirs like fasting and all kinds of medicines, and science has given us organ transplants and all kinds of things to help us stay alive so that we may never die. I'll never forget when I was first ordained a priest. I was 25 years old and I was a hospital chaplain. And I lived in the hospital with the interns, the medical interns who were all my age. And I remember them coming to talk to me as a young priest. They were depressed that they lost a patient, that they were becoming doctors to keep people staying alive. And one of them actually said, I'm trying to let them stay alive for 100, 200 years. Now, this is the first narrative, the staying alive elixir. And you do see these in the stories of finding potions and alchemy, and some of even the medieval alchemists trying to find it. And even in Harry Potter, in the Harry Potter of night, you have the stone. What is that called? It's the stone that the Flamels had, the stone, and it kept them alive for however long they wanted. I don't remember the name of that. It wasn't the Philosopher's Stone. It was, you remember, Marion, what it was?
I don't remember. I'm sorry.
Okay, but anyway, you see this in modern literature, this narrative. We can prevent you from dying because we got the right elixir. Okay? When that became obvious in cultural evolution, people began to say, well, this doesn't seem real. It seems like no matter how long we try to stay alive with our little potions, we're all going to physically die. So then historically, the next story, the next immortality narrative is the narrative of resurrection that you see with some of the groupings of the Jews. And you see this also in the Egyptian narratives, that the dead would come back to life. They would be resurrected with Osiris, Isis and Osiris narratives. And you see it certainly in the narrative of Jesus, that the story is that the dead will be raised on the last day. And you see it in Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians that we are reading during these November days. We would not have you be unaware, brothers and sisters, that those who have fallen asleep, because this is the way death was portrayed in Paul's Judaism, that death is a kind of a falling asleep, and that on the last day, the archangel's trumpet would sound. You see this also in 1 Corinthians 15. And the trumpet would sound, and the dead would be raised up with Christ. And if we have died with Christ in baptism, and because this part of the whole physical resurrection and the immortality narrative of literal immortality through resurrection was already anticipated in the mystical death with Christ through baptism. We have modern ways in which this narrative is being used, and Stephen Cave in his book talks about things like cryogenics, where we're trying to save the bodies of people by freezing them until at some point we have figured out through science how to cure a disease and resurrect them and make them come alive again. Now, this is not quite the same as the Christian narrative. In fact, it's quite different than the Christian narrative, but the attempt, the story of saying we can resurrect the body is still among us and still around us. That's the second narrative. Now, with the introduction of Christianity into the Greek world, there was a third narrative that Stephen Cave talks about, and that's the narrative of the soul, so that the body, the idea that the body would totally resurrect after it had decayed, the imagination, the Christian imagination, uh, took on the flavor of the Greek imagination, especially of the Gnostic world, where the body itself was just a prison, and it was the soul that would be immortal. So we talk about the immortal soul. And so Christianity then takes this pagan narrative, because the immortality of the soul was not what the Jewish narrative of resurrection, the Egyptian narrative of resurrection was all about. They were, the resurrection narrative is you fell asleep and you were in your grave in Sheol, and then when the Messiah comes again, and for Christianity and St. Paul, they thought it was pretty soon, when the angel would blow the trumpets, then the bodies that were sleeping would come out. And we still do this as Catholics with our understanding of resurrection and that immortality narrative. When we bury our dead, if you recall, we bury our dead in Catholic cemeteries still facing the east, so that their heads are facing the east. And the idea is, through a literal understanding of immortality, a literal resurrection, that when the angels blow the trumpets, the coffins will open, the dead bodies will come out, and then no one will have to turn around because you're facing the east and the Messiah is coming from the east. We're going to sing that in one of the Advent songs. People look east, the time is near. That's all part of the resurrection narrative. But the soul narrative, which we see in Plato and the Greek world, was that the body just rots. It's material. The material world is the shadow of things. The real world is the soul world. And so the soul is immortal. And what happens in paradise, we took over in our Christian world, which causes a question with Christian anthropology, because a human is a body and spirit in a communion, body and spirit woven together. And so when you use the soul narrative, you're basically saying that you're still alive, not sleeping, like the resurrection narrative would have us be, sleeping, resting in peace, RIP, but rather when the soul narrative enters, now you got the dilemma, well, can we be a disincarnated soul and still be human? You know, this is the big question. So can you separate the soul and still be a human being? And so you get Karl Rahner talking about being pan-cosmic, and so that at the moment of death, our soul takes on a new body with the cosmos itself. We do all kinds of theological talks, so that we have to face that somehow our Christianity has taken on the pagan notion of the immortality of the soul. And there you have this wonderful image of that happening. And so you have in contemporary world, you have not only the Buddhist understanding of reincarnation that was also part of this early on, but you also have the notion that we can upload our consciousness onto a computer. And you've seen, there are films about this, where the consciousness of a dying person can be uploaded into a computer program, which is again that same narrative of the soul, of the disincarnation of the narrative of the soul. So you got that continuing, and you also have this transhumanism experience with artificial intelligence. That's also part of that same narrative. We can put someone's consciousness into artificial intelligence, into a robotic, and therefore you achieve immortality through technology. So this narrative is still around. This narrative is around, and when we talk about how to prepare funerals on the third week, I'll show you that our funeral book is a bit split between the soul narrative and the resurrection narrative. Because some of the prayers for the funeral actually pray that people will rest in peace until the day of the resurrection. And then this narrative, the immortality of the soul narrative, comes into play where we're praying that they'll immediately have a place in paradise. And you see Dante in his Divina Commedia, you see Dante developing what happens in paradise, and it's kind of interesting to watch these two immortality narratives. And Stephen Cave talk about this, how that as Christianity evolves and Christ doesn't come back quickly, how we then take on this other narrative of the immortality of the soul and bring it into our Christianity. There's a lot more you can say with this about saints, and certainly about patron saints, and certainly as we develop this notion of purgatory, which certainly comes by the 12th century. The birth of purgatory happens doctrinally. You do have this whole thing of the intercession of the church militant and the church triumphant and the church suffering, which is again playing off of this narrative of the immortality of the soul. And then we say, then at the last day, when the trumpet blows, the souls will be reunited and we will be resurrected. So we're putting both narratives together, which they were not from the beginning. St. Paul would have not recognized this narrative. Then the fourth narrative is he's saying, well, there are many folks during the centuries in different cultures that no longer believed in any of these literal immortality narratives, that post-mortem, after death, there is something of a survival, either by way of resurrection, reincarnation, or by way of the immortality of the soul, post-mortem. By the way, I'm going to be teaching another course next quarter in DePaul on esotericism and occultism in the United States. And we're going to read a book by Dr. Moody, who is very, very much into researching these near-death experiences of people. And he's written a new book on the logic of nonsense. And basically, Moody's claim is, again, of the immortality of the soul narrative. He would play into that, saying that what we're dealing with in the near-death experiences is the scientific validation of the immortality of the soul. And that certainly has been questioned by scientists, whether or not that's just a physiological deterioration of the brain that gives a sensation of something of the spheres of light and all of that. But that is another contemporary version of the immortality of the soul. These narratives of out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. Now, as the quest for some understanding of the meaning of life and the question of death and beyond, as it evolves, you do see even early on, not even early on, within some of the cultures that Cave describes in his book, you see a fourth narrative, which is, I'm just going to settle for symbolic narrative, symbolic immortality, not for literal, but symbolic. I'm going to look at my works and my children. I'm going to look at my works, look at all the books I've written at CTU, and I'm going to leave a legacy, and my name is going to be important, and I'll be on the internet forever, and people will read my blog posts and my Facebooks, and I'm going to now have a legacy that will change, that people will remember me forever. So that's one of the contemporary versions of what they call symbolic immortality, through my legacy or through my children. Look at what I've done. This is a generational photograph here. Look at my generations. And many people are happy with this. Because this does not depend upon what Moody would talk about, the nonsense of the word life after death. Because even if you just take that phrase, life after death, there's something irrational about, nonsensical about that. And yet it's the very thing that we engage in with the resurrection narratives and with the immortality of the soul narrative. And certainly what the first narrative was looking for, namely the narrative of staying alive, the Elixir narrative, that was also looking to never physically die, so that you would have, if you would, a literal immortality, but not dying. This is a symbolic immortality, the legacy one, by look at what I'm leaving behind, and my name will be remembered. You know, they'll name a school after me, a library after me. They'll continue reading my books, etc., etc. My children will remember me. My DNA will stay alive. And this is what Stephen Cave says is the fourth one. Now I have about 5 minutes left. Let me finish up by saying there is another way that Stephen Caves talks about that's happening in our culture with some of our young people. Our young people I'm finding with working with them at DePaul, for instance, there's really not a lot of belief in a post-death consciousness, nor even a need for that to motivate their lives or their moral lives, which it can do. Nor is there but there is a movement towards, I'm not even concerned about leaving a legacy, but can I write a good story by walking in the way of wisdom? Can I walk in the way of wisdom and live my life in gratitude and in caring for others and in outreaches of justice? Can I engage in the wisdom of the elders, of the ancestors, without believing in, or without banking on, or without being motivated by any kind of post death narrative of immortality or resurrection, or even of elixir, or even of having to leave a legacy? Can I just live my life beautifully without any of those concerns? And so that's how Stephen Cave ends his book. That's my review of the book. It's certainly it portrays a kind of a historical sketch, I think, quite well, and I would recommend it for you to read. He also has a TED talk, about an 18-minute TED talk on these narratives that you can watch to see if I've done him justice, because I'm not asking you to believe me and my interpretation of the book, but I just found it, and my students have found it to be a good historical developmental analysis of how our awareness of death, he calls it the mortality paradox, where we as human creatures know that we're going to die. And we know that, and we at the same time can't conceive of ourselves dying. That's the mortality paradox. The paradox is we know we're going to die, but we can't picture it. How through the centuries, cultures and religious traditions have developed these narratives to help us engage, if you would, the existential anxiety that comes simply by being human.
Thanks so much, Richard. I really appreciated that outline of those four and then the fifth approach to this. I'm going to just start by inviting you to put questions into the chat. I'm aware that that's going to take a couple minutes. So actually I have a question to get us started with, and then we'll see how this proceeds. As you were sharing these different approaches, Richard, as someone who has a great passion for the Hebrew Bible, I was thinking a lot about Ecclesiastes. And there's the line in it's 12:7 of toward the end of life, the dust, the earth returning, to dust, the body returning to dust, and the breath returning back to God. And so it's this sort of reversal of actually the creation narrative where God breathes breathes life into the earth creature.
And the breath returns.
Yeah, so it's kind of that soul. But there's also a bit, I think, in Ecclesiastes that takes that fifth approach of just cutting back against any clear answer. I don't know if you have any comments on that. I see them.
No, it's in there. And certainly that's part of the wisdom literature that we ascribe to as in our Catholic canon. But the breath, I'm not sure, is the same as the immortal soul that we see in the Greek world. I'm not sure it's this. I'm not sure that in the book of Ecclesiastes, when the breath returns, it's the life force, but not. I'm not sure if it's the personal soul that you get in that narrative of the immortality of the soul, where I'm still conscious post death. Again, I'm not an Old Testament scholar, but from my reading of that literature, it's basically your body's going to go back to dust. So live a good life, work hard, don't complain, vanity of vanities. It's all vanity, but live a good life anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when I first noticed it is that even the fact that they have that line of the breath returning to God from when it came. So that means that return to God, who is the God of life, right, is kind of an interesting, whether or not it's a particular to, our individual personal identity. Yeah.
Also, we got the chat. It's the Sorcerer's Stone.
Yes.
Or in the British edition, it's the Philosopher's Stone. Thank you for that. That was the elixir. If you had the stone, you would never die. Mm-hmm. And so Voldemort, I mean, the Harry Potter novels are these amazing novels about death and immortality. All of them. That she has developed that as a contemporary. Look at this.
Mm-hmm. So I see a question there. And I'm wondering, is that in referring to Genesis? In Genesis, death is a punishment. Some people still think it is. How would we want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, it is considered a punishment in Genesis. In other words, this sense of death, or again, in the Jewish world, for some who did not believe in resurrection, it was just a kind of a shady kind of existence. Remember the argument with the Pharisees and the Sadducees in early in the Christian in the Gospels. You see Jesus saying, Jesus, who was certainly believing as a Pharisee in the resurrection of the dead, and his resurrection inaugurates that. Yeah, I mean, death is a punishment, and I think what Christianity does to death with its resurrection narratives, especially with baptism, it turns it into death has been swallowed up in victory, St. Paul says. Death, where is your sting? First Corinthians 15. Death, where is your sting? Death, where is your victory? The sting of death is sin. But thanks be to God who has given the victory over death in Christ, so that even though that Christianity, Christ takes upon us himself the punishment of death by dying. And you see this in the Greek Orthodox Easter liturgies. Christos anesti ek nekron, thanato thanaton, that he has trampled death by death. You see, this is the richness of the Christian resurrection narrative. Just powerful that this punishment that Genesis talks about of death, that we all will have to go through and face, is now in Christ, and for those who have died with Christ in baptism, becomes so that death is no longer an executioner punishing us, but death is an angel that comes to, if you would, hush us along, so that we might rest in peace. And this is strict resurrection narrative until resurrection day, when the trumpets will sound. You see, and then when you bring in the immortality of the soul narrative, which we do in Christianity, then you say, well, we now are in paradise, and we're in a heavenly realm, and we can canonize the saints, and they have power to intercede for us. And in fact, the canonization process is about the immortality of the soul narrative, because the resurrection, the canonization of saints depends on the immortality of the soul, that the soul is now with God in heaven. And we say to the person, Solanus Casey, prove to us that you're in heaven, that you have intercessory power. And we say, work a miracle, and then we'll beatify you. And work another miracle, and we'll canonize you. You follow? This is all part of this wonderful tradition of literal immortality of the soul narrative and of the narrative of the resurrection that come together in later Christianity.
Yeah, and I had one comment that ties that more completely into the concept of the communion of saints.
Oh, absolutely.
Persons, of course, finding comfort in that along with the intercessory.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and that the dead are with us and that they lurk. I'm doing Jungian analysis right now, and I'm looking at Carl Jung's Red Book. If you've ever seen the Red Book by Carl Jung, it's all about that the soul, he's very much into the immortality of the soul narrative, which again, we have baptized from the Greek world into Christianity, from our Jewish roots. And he basically, in one part of the Red Book, talks about the dead, the souls of the dead that are lurking in the rafters. They're around in the rafters. And certainly, one of the reasons why Catholicism, for me, is such a powerful religious tradition is because we publicly, and again, proclaim that death has been swallowed up in the victory of Christ. We participate in the communion of saints through baptism, where we have died with Christ. And so therefore, to the students at DePaul, I'm giving them the Christian tradition of die before you die. So when you die, there's not much left of you to die, so that you can really live without being afraid of death. The other book that I want to recommend to you that I use with my students at DePaul, I use with the students at CTU in the initiation class, is called The Slavery of Death by Richard Beck, B-E-C-K. Richard Beck is engaged with this whole question of that was raised by Ernest Becker in his cultural analysis of Western culture, called The Denial of Death, in 1975, winning the Pulitzer Prize for that book. And Richard Beck translates that into a Christian narrative called The Slavery of Death. And he's using the letter to the Hebrews, where he talks about we are all under the slavery of death, and that slavery of death creates an anxiety which is the root of evil, according to the letter of the Hebrews, because the devil, Satan, has power over that, over death. But then Christ certainly redeems that by his death and resurrection, and now with this more Greek understanding of the immortal soul. Anything else, Marian?
Yeah, I had a question, and you were starting to get a little bit into it, but it's from your work with these narrative approaches, what do you hope your students will use in this process of keeping death always before your eyes? What do you hope that they'll carry with them?
I take it it's the students at DePaul,
Yes.
the younger one.
Yeah.
The students at DePaul. I'm just hoping that the egoic death, which is what Benedict I think is getting, because there's many kinds of deaths, not just physical death. There's social death, relational death, there's psychological death, spiritual death. But the culprit, it seems, is the egoic death that even St. Paul talks about when he talks about it is no longer we who live, but Christ who lives in us. Because of Christ who's died, we now can live a new life. That's what I'm hoping. Because many of these young people have no interest in institutionalized religion. I look at them as pre-catechumens. If any of you are familiar with the catechumenal process, these are pre-catechumens that are looking for meaning in their lives. And so I'm giving them the rule of St. Benedict, because what Benedict is talking about in chapter 4 are all the ways in which the ego, our personal egos, can be relativized so that the deeper Christness within us can be actualized through us, if you would. So that's what I'm hoping, that they'll find, and many of them, I can't tell you the number, have called me through the years and have joined catechumenates. Maybe 10. Now, that may not seem like a lot, but they're coming to it in a way that that I hope will raise the question: do we have to live all entangled in the egoic self, or is there another way of living? And can we thematize that for non-Catholics, non-Christians, in a way that they can respond to it? And that's what I'm hoping to do as pre-catechumens.
Great. Well, maybe depending on how long it takes, we'll do one or two more, and then I can actually hold some of these for our next session as well, because I think some of these questions will continue to rise up. One is from, I am a hospital chaplain, and as I think about the patients that I walk with and I see all 5 narratives in my journeys with them, I see my role as the chaplain is to help patients to figure out where they are in their narrative. How do you encourage these narratives when the person dying and the family might not recognize their narratives? I suppose it's when meaning making is not happening.
Yeah, that's kind of like saying to someone, you're going to run a marathon, but you've never trained for it. When you get to when you get to the dying stages, I'm not sure I would have those kinds of conversations with anybody. Um, but you in order to run a marathon, you got to be in shape. And I think death, and someone wrote something very interesting, Mr. Al Utzik, I don't know where you are. He says that death is not a punishment. Yes, it is. In Genesis, it is a punishment. In Genesis, that is, and it is, and indeed we know now for us it's a natural to all living. Correct. And yes, the sting is the fear of death or the anxiety over death. That is correct. But when that anxiety becomes so overwhelming, it becomes indistinguishable from death itself. So that the training that Benedict is talking about, having death always before our eyes, to train for the dying, which is why in the early world of the philosophers, you studied philosophy. You studied philosophy to get ready for death, to know what was really meaningful in living. And so my answer to the question about the hospital is sometimes when those kinds of questions are something you don't deal with, except perhaps give witness to what my faith is in that case. But I think that we need to prepare for the marathon before we have to run it. And I think that to that end, I hope this class is at least a moment of that training.
Great. Well, I'm mindful of the time. There are a couple questions. I'm going to download the chat and make sure you have it, Richard, because I do want to explore at some point some comments around just different cultural approaches to death. And I think some of them maybe are different combinations of the 5 types. So I'll save that, and those are topics we can come back to.
Probably next week, if anyone returns, we can continue. We can answer those before we go into the second topic about purgatory. Let me just give you an assignment. Your assignment, if you're going to return next week, is I want you to read Benedict XVI's section in his encyclical Spe Salvi, S-P-E, Spe Salvi, S-A-L-V-I. He has a whole section on the 4 last things: death, judgment, heaven, hell, and then he adds purgatory. And he does a brilliant job in reframing our Catholic doctrine of purgatory. And I'd like to investigate that with you from a Catholic perspective, because we live and move and have our being in the expectation of the blessed hope and the joyful coming of our Savior, Jesus Christ. I mean, this is essential to us and essential to social justice and all of the rest, because it is I think it's the promise that we live in. Thank you all very much for this opportunity.